So, it's 1492. Spain has just finished the Reconquista, a casual 781-year-long project to push the Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula. This leaves the Spanish crown with a very specific problem: a massive surplus of battle-hardened, religiously zealous young men with swords, no jobs, and a complete inability to farm. What do you do with them? Well, luckily, a guy from Genoa just bumped into a couple of continents while looking for India. Problem solved. The motto of the resulting enterprise was famously God, Gold, and Glory. A wonderfully noble sentiment, though if you look at their actual behavior, the order seems to have been aggressively reversed. God was more of a justification you stapled on at the end, after you'd secured the gold and gloriously stabbed anyone who disagreed. These weren't explorers in the gentle David Attenborough sense. They were military contractors on a high-risk, high-reward venture capital project, and the New World was ripe for a hostile takeover. Before you can conquer people, you have to give them fair warning. It's just polite. The Spanish, being sticklers for bureaucracy, invented a truly magnificent tool for this, the requerimento. This was a legal document, a declaration of divine right that conquistadors were required to read to any indigenous people they encountered. It explained the entire history of Christianity, the authority of the Pope, and the Spanish monarch's God-given claim to these new lands. After this brief theological lecture, the locals were invited to convert and accept Spanish rule. If they refused, well, the document helpfully stated that the deaths and losses which shall accrue from this are your fault and not of their highnesses. Of course, this was read in Spanish, to people who spoke Nahuatl or Quechua, often from the deck of a ship or to an empty village. It was the 16th century equivalent of scrolling to the bottom of a 200-page end-user license agreement and clicking "I agree" just before your computer is forcibly reformatted. Utterly absurd, but legally, they had all their bases covered. Hern Cortez landed in Mexico in 1519 with about 500 men, 13 horses, and an amount of self-confidence that should be studied by science. He was facing the Aztec Empire, a civilization of millions. The plan was, to put it mildly, ambitious. He scuttled his own ships to ensure there was no turning back, a classic burning the bridges management technique. Upon reaching the magnificent city of Tenochtitlan, he was welcomed by the Emperor Moctezuma II. Cortes' way of saying thank you was to place the emperor under house arrest in his own palace. It's an unparalleled power move. Imagine being invited to dinner and then informing the host they're now your hostage. But the real key to his success wasn't strategy. It was germs. A smallpox epidemic brought by the Spanish tore through the Aztec population who had zero immunity. It killed more people than any sword ever could, wiping out an estimated 40% of the population of central Mexico in a single year. Cortes didn't conquer the Aztecs alone. He had a silent, microscopic, and utterly devastating ally. If you thought Cortez was audacious, allow me to introduce Francisco Pizarro. He decided to take on the Inca Empire, the largest empire in pre-Columbian America, with just 168 men. That's not an army, that's a moderately successful school trip. Pizarro had impeccable, if morbid, timing. He arrived in the middle of a brutal civil war between two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, who were fighting for the throne. Pizarro arranged a meeting with the victor, Atahualpa, in the town of Cajamarca. Atahualpa arrived with several thousand unarmed attendants because why would you expect a meeting to be an ambush? Pizarro's 168 men, using cannons and cavalry, slaughtered them. Atahualpa was captured. In a desperate bid for freedom, he offered a legendary ransom to fill a room about 22 feet by 17 feet, once with gold and twice with silver. The Inca delivered. For months, treasures poured in. And once the room was full, Pizarro had Atahualpa charged with treason and publicly executed. It turns out the fine print on the ransom agreement was a little tricky. It was a masterclass in efficiency, treachery, and proving that having overwhelming numbers doesn't help much when the other side has no honor whatsoever. The technological gap between the Spanish and the peoples of the Americas was less a gap and more a chasm. First, you have steel. A Spanish conquistador sword, probably made in Toledo, was a finely crafted instrument of death. The Aztecs' primary weapon was the macahuitl, a wooden club embedded with obsidian blades. Terrifying, yes, but it shatters against steel armor. Then there were the guns. An arquebus was slow to load, wildly inaccurate, and likely to misfire in the rain. But the smoke, the noise, the fire, it was a psychological weapon of immense power. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. And then you have the living weapons, horses. To people who had never seen a large domesticated animal, a man on horseback looked like some kind of monstrous divine centaur. Finally, and most brutally, were the war dogs. The Spanish brought mastiffs and alanos, huge dogs bred for war, trained to tear people apart on command. They were used to hunt down fugitives and break enemy formations, an element of pure terror that often did more damage than the soldiers themselves. Once the conquering was done, the administration had to begin. And the Spanish had to begin with a system of beautiful, legalistic evil called the encomienda. On paper, it sounded almost noble. A Spanish encomendero was granted a number of native laborers. In return, he was responsible for their protection, education, and conversion to Christianity. It was a trusteeship. In reality, it was slavery in all but name, a license to exploit. Hundreds of thousands were forced into brutal labor and silver mines, like the infamous mountain of Potos in modern-day Bolivia, a place that proverbially ate men. Life expectancy in the mines was abysmal. Others were worked to death on plantations. The protection part of the deal was conveniently forgotten. To be fair, this system horrified some Spaniards. A Dominican friar named Bartolomé de las Casas spent his life campaigning against its abuses, writing harrowing accounts of the cruelty he witnessed. His work gave rise to the Black Legend of Spanish cruelty, mostly by providing a perfectly detailed instruction manual of said cruelty for Spain's enemies to use as propaganda. He argued for the humanity of the indigenous peoples, a shockingly controversial stance at the time. The success of Cortés and Pizarro created a very dangerous idea that the Americas were just filled with empires made of gold, waiting to be toppled. This sparked a multi-generational gold rush, sending thousands of Spaniards on doomed expeditions into jungles and swamps, chasing rumors of El Dorado, the lost city of gold. These ventures were almost universally catastrophic failures. Take Hernando de Soto's expedition through what is now the southeastern United States. For 4 years, he and his men wandered around, finding no gold but managing to terrorize, enslave, and infect nearly every native group they met, leaving a trail of social collapse in their wake. De Soto himself died of a fever and was secretly buried in the Mississippi River so the locals wouldn't desecrate his body. Then there's Francisco de Orellana, who got separated from Gonzalo Pizarro's expedition and ended up being the first European to navigate the entire length of the Amazon River. It was an incredible feat of survival, but his party resorted to eating their shoes, their belts, and each other. The quest for imaginary gold was often far more destructive than the conquest of real treasures. It's easy to paint the conquistadors as one-dimensional monsters, but the reality is a bit more complicated. They weren't just evil, they were desperate. Many were hidalgos, members of the lower nobility who had a prestigious family name, but no actual wealth or land. In Spain, they had no prospects. The New World was their only shot at fame and fortune. They were gamblers playing for the highest possible stakes. This wasn't a state-funded invasion, these were private enterprises. Conquistadors had to buy their own armor, their own weapons, their own horses. They often went deep into debt to join an expedition. Failure meant not just death, but financial ruin for their families back home. Add to this the potent psychological cocktail of the Reconquista. They were steeped in a culture that saw holy war against non-Christians not just as acceptable, but as a righteous duty. They genuinely believed they were serving God by conquering and converting, even if their primary motivation was greed. This mix of religious fervor, crushing debt, and immense personal ambition created a personality capable of incredible bravery and unspeakable cruelty, often in the same afternoon. How do you justify all of this back home? With a very good PR campaign. The narrative of the conquest became a battleground of its own. On one side, you have the White Legend, the official story promoted by the Spanish crown. This version emphasized the civilizing mission. They were bringing salvation, law, and order to savage peoples. They ended human sacrifice. They built universities. On the other side, you have the Black Legend. This was enthusiastically promoted by Spain's Protestant rivals, like England and the Netherlands. They took the writings of people like Bartolomé de las Casas and used them to paint the entire Spanish enterprise as uniquely barbaric and genocidal, conveniently ignoring their own colonial ambitions. The truth, as usual, is that both are a mix of fact and propaganda. The conquest was exceptionally brutal, and the justifications were self-serving. But seeing it as a unique Spanish evil misses the point. It was a preview of the colonial playbook that nearly every European power would use for the next 400 years. Spain just got there first, and, you have to admit, they were remarkably thorough. So what's the final takeaway from this whole bloody enterprise? The Spanish conquest wasn't just a series of random atrocities committed by greedy men. It was a system, a methodical machine for colonization, powered by a blend of advanced weaponry, devastating diseases, and a legal framework designed to justify any action. From the theological excuse of the requerimiento to the economic engine of the encomienda, every step was calculated for maximum extraction of wealth and control. The conquistadors were the sharp, violent edge of a much larger imperial project. Their methods were brutal because brutality was efficient. They created a new world on the ashes of the old, a process that was as catastrophic for the people already living there as it was profitable for Spain. It's a stark reminder that some of the biggest changes in history weren't driven by noble ideals, but by the simple, timeless, and remarkably effective strategy of showing up and deciding someone else's property is now yours, armed with better weapons and a really good story. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!